Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're very pleased tonight to have a person we consider one of our own. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Richard Harrison, has done extensive research here in the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. He's been with us literally since we opened the building. I would say that he has spent more time in this building than any other researcher, and perhaps even more than some of the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center staff. He is here studying not only his holdings, but our holdings, and what we have tonight is his most recent effort in Russian military history. Dr. Harrison received his PhD in War Studies from King's College in London in 1994. Previously, he has been employed by the DePuy Institute in Washington, D.C., and the U.S. Defense Department's Office of POW/MA Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He's also spent several years in the Russian capital conducting book-related research. He is currently an adjunct professor of history at York College here in Pennsylvania. His first book, The Russian Way of War, Operational Art 1904 to 1940, was published by the University Press of Kansas in 2001. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Richard Harrison.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you for that very kind introduction. Before I even get started, I would like to thank personally the staff here at MHI for all its help that it has given me in the many years that I spent here working on this book. I don't know why the place where I work gets a protective plastic sheet. I won't even think why that is the case. But I'm very grateful to MHI and all the help its staff has given me, particularly as the subject of my topic tonight, or the subject of my book, lies so far outside its normal area of research. As a longtime attendee of these talks, I've heard some obscure topics in my time, but I think tonight I'm going to take the prize. This is a shame because the subject of my talk, Georgy Samoilovich Isserson, I believe is one of the most seminal military theorists of the 20th century. Despite the fact that he is almost completely unknown, that he's completely unknown in the West and nearly as completely unknown in his native country. In putting together this talk, I ran into the problem of boiling down Isserson's life. He was a very prolific writer in the fields of military history, tactics, operational art, and strategy. However, his signature contribution to Soviet military thought is the theory of the deep operation. And so that's what I would like to concentrate on tonight. And because I feel that this had a decisive impact in the way the Red Army fought World War II. Now, before getting to the heart of this matter, to the heart of the lecture, I have to take a couple of back steps in order to fill you in on the details of Isserson's life. It's not as though I can come in here and give a lecture on Spotsylvania and expect everyone to know the basic information about the principles involved. Again, Isserson is a complete unknown, and so we'll have to go back to the time just to bring you up in order to get an idea not only of the man, but of the perilous times in which he lived. Isserson was born into a middle-class Jewish family on June 16, 1898, in Kaunas, a provincial town on the western periphery of the Russian Empire, now in the independent state of Lithuania. His father was a military doctor, and his mother, at least according to family legend, was from Königsberg, then in East Prussia. And it was from her that Isserson acquired his fluency in German, which was to stand him in good stead throughout his life. This is Isserson here on the left, and this is his sister Lucy, who's 2 years older. Unfortunately, it says, being Jewish, she was caught up in the havoc of the Soviet invasion of the Soviet Union in World War II, and she and her son died in the Kaunas ghetto in 1943. World War I broke out in 1914, and the following summer the Germans came driving the Issersohns out of Kaunas. The following year, Issersohn enrolled in the university in Petrograd. He was drafted into the army in 1917. There's a picture of Issersohn as a teenager with his parents. Issersohn was drafted into the Tsarist army in 1917, but he caught the army as it was collapsing, and after going rudimentary officer training, he simply deserted, as hundreds of thousands were doing at the time, and the army collapsed. He was also in the hospital at the time of the Bolshevik coup in Petrograd in November of 1917 and did not take part in those events. Issersohn joined the Red Army in June 1918, and first as a political commissar. He was stationed in the northern part of the country around Archangel and spent much of the next 2 years fighting bands of white soldiers and as well as Greens, peasant revolutionaries who wanted no part of either the Reds or the Whites. He was wounded in 1919 in a skirmish with British gunboats in the northern part of the country. And in 1920, his unit was sent to the Polish front when war broke out between Poland and the Soviet state. And it was there in the summer of 1920 that he made the switch from the role of political commissar to a line officer, becoming a deputy regimental commander. However, at the time, as people who know something about the course of the Polish-Soviet War of 1920, the Red Army attacked out of Belarusia and greatly overextended itself in the course of following up on its victory. And when the Poles struck back in August, they cut off a number of Soviet armies who were far to the west of Warsaw. One of these was Issersohn's. And so he and thousands of others, Red Army soldiers, were forced to cross the border into East Prussia, where they were interned for the duration. After several months rattling around various German internment camps, peace was signed and Issersohn returned to the Soviet Union at the end of 1920. Issersohn then made the decision, I guess he'd had plenty of time to mull about over his future in internment camp, so he decided that he would make the military his career. And he applied for admission to the new Red Army, or RKKA, Military Academy, which had just opened up 2 years before. He graduated from the academy in 1924. Following his graduation, his career varied between line and staff assignments. Along the way, he served under a number of people who were later to become very famous in the Red Army. Here's the obligatory class picture. Sometime, I think this is probably around 1923. There's Issersohn right there. He's already only 25 years old. He's already sporting the shaved head look, which was very popular amongst Red Army officers at the time. This is some kind of gathering. Actually, the occasion for the picture is a visit to the academy by a number of high-ranking officers. Amongst them are Alexander Yegorov, Sergei Bubnov, and Mikhail Frunze. It says a great deal about the interwar Red Army that all three of these men came to a bad end. Yegorov was shot in 1939, Bubnov in 1940, and Frunze, who later became War Commissar in 1925, died the same year mysteriously during a medical operation which was not necessary, but which the Politburo forced him to undergo in any event. So you draw your own conclusions. Here's some more people he served with. Vladimir Triandafilov, who became his mentor and sort of had a calming effect on Issersohn, who was very opinionated and did not suffer fools, or at least people he regarded as fools, gladly. Boris Shaposhnikov, one of the Red Army's leading lights, actually Issersohn despised this man. Shaposhnikov was a former Tsarist officer who had thrown in his lot with the Red Army when the Civil War broke out. But he still retained a lot of his old Tsarist attitudes and Isurson always felt that he had been too much influenced by the experience of World War I and was not open enough to new ideas in the 1930s. This is Semyon Timoshenko in his marshal's uniform later on. Isurson was part of Timoshenko's brain trust. Timoshenko himself was not overly literate, so if he needed a speech made or something polished, he would turn to people like Isurson. During this time, Isurson courted and married this woman, Yekaterina Ivanovna Fedulova. Her father had been a prosperous merchant in Siberia before the revolution, and of course they were dispossessed. They got married in 1928 and had one daughter, who I had the privilege of interviewing in Moscow. Isurson had been long dead by the time I started writing this book, but I was able to get a good deal of family information from her. This woman, she died in 1992. Unfortunately, the marriage did not work out. Isurson was extremely self-centered, and I don't know, to look at him, he doesn't look like much, but he was very popular with the ladies and had numerous affairs. And his wife finally, thanks to their daughter's prodding, got up the gumption to divorce him in 1951 while he was still cooling his heels in a labor camp. From 1929 to 1933, Isurson was an instructor at the Frunze Military Academy and was briefly head of the Academy's operational department. That is, teaching the new discipline of operational art to a new generation of Soviet commanders. Following a 3-year assignment in Belarusia, he returned to Moscow, where he was appointed professor at the new General Staff Academy. And he quickly rose to head the department's, the Academy's Department of Operational Art / Army Operations. Now, 1937-38, Stalin's military purge takes place, striking down thousands of officers, many of them Isurson's intimates. By all at least by the reasoning of the purges, he should have gone the way of all of their flesh, at least, but he didn't. He miraculously survived. Again, many people around him died. His, I won't say mentor, but Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the leading lights of the Red Army, probably its most brilliant strategic theorist at the time. He and Isurson actually had a number of run-ins. As his daughter once put it, a black cat seemed to have crossed their path. And although they respected each other, their relations were nonetheless very strained. Of course, after the purges, you try to distance yourself from someone like this. Another individual who fell at the time was the aforementioned Yegorov. Isurson did a lot of the brain work for Yegorov as well. In 1936, Yegorov asked him to basically draw up a manual for the conduct of operations. He did. Yegorov took it, put it in his safe, and the document disappeared along with Yegorov. Yeronim Uberevich, Isurson suffered, well, he did suffer under him, yes. He served under him twice, once in the north during the Civil War and in Belarusia. And Robert Edeman, who was briefly head of the Frunze Military Academy while Isurson was there. As opposed to Shaposhnikov, whom I've shown earlier, Isurson had a great deal of respect for Edeman. Edeman was very open to some of the new ideas that were coming in and gave Isurson and other the young officers their head and allowed them to pursue their investigations without restraint. He, Uberevich, and Tukhachevsky were all executed at the same time on trumped-up charges of aiding the Germans in 1937. Isurson, like I said, miraculously survived, although in those days, well, just like any army, your service record follows you around. And so if you received a recommendation from an executed officer, an officer who was declared enemy of the people, it's only natural that the authorities would think you are in cahoots with this enemy of the people and that you will be executed in turn. For some reason, Isurson escaped this. I had the good fortune of reviewing his arrest record in the old KGB archives, and part of the record is full of denunciations of Isurson by various people who were arrested and subsequently executed. For some reason, the authorities never touched him at the time. But these things could follow you around, and just sort of like a cancer. And they would wait, and this file would be there waiting until the day the authorities needed it to make a case against you. Then they would break the file out and said, "Oh my God, look at all this testimony against you." And then you would be arrested, which is what happened to Isurson in 1941. In 1939, Isurson campaigned for and was appointed to Chief of Staff of the Soviet 7th Army, which had charge of breaking through the Mannerheim Line during the Soviet-Finnish War of 1939-1940. For reasons which never became clear. Again, I was reading his arrest record, and of course, Isurson's trying to fob off the blame for this fiasco on someone else, so it's never quite clear exactly where the fault lay. Anyway, the Army failed to break through the Mannerheim Line, and Isurson was cashiered, demoted, and sent to a rear area training assignment shortly afterwards, after which he was transferred back to the academy, which I guess proves that those who can't teach. Isurson, his past or whatever, finally caught up with him on June 7th, 1941, 2 weeks before the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. He was arrested on a bus in Moscow. He had just finished his what would prove to be his last, at least active duty work. He had turned it into the publisher and was taking the bus home, and they grabbed him and sent him to jail. His daughter once told me that they had later heard from someone high up in the Ministry of Defense that Isurson's arrest had been percolating for some time, but word got back to the authorities that Isurson was working on this very important theoretical work. And Stalin himself had written on the page, they used to have arrest list, several pages long, and Stalin himself had wrote across from Isurson's name, "Don't touch him for now, let him finish his book." So as soon as his book was finished and he was no longer of any use, he was arrested. He was accused of the usual anti-Soviet charges, and in early 1942, interrogated and beaten for several months, even as the war rages. So this is the paradox. This is the interesting thing about the Red Army at the time. As the country is in its greatest peril, as the German armies are sweeping through the country, their greatest operational theorist is being beaten in prison on trumped-up charges. Finally, the authorities, he never confesses. He tries to distance himself, to be sure, from a number of people, but I guess he figured these people were dead anyway, so it wouldn't hurt. There's no loss of honor there. So he was sentenced to death in January of 1942. And for reasons which I was never able to discover, in a fit of what the Russians call rotten liberalism, his sentence was revoked, and he was sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp and 5 years of internal exile. So he managed to survive that. He later returned, he was rehabilitated in 1955 and returned. This is what you look like when you get back. He's about 57, 58 years old at this point. So this is what years of camp will do to you. He returned a physically broken man, still very alert mentally, but physically falling apart. Isurson, despite his many afflictions by this time, lived for another 20 years. In the thaw that followed Stalin's death, he put out a number of articles detailing his academic and military career, as well as a biography of Tukhachevsky. He married twice more, but and I was never able to find out anything about his second wife, but he finally died on April 27th, 1976, a very bitter man. Here was a man who he was an Orthodox communist, dedicated his life to preparing his countrymen and preparing himself for the war that he felt was inevitable against Nazi Germany. And on the eve of the war, he is removed from the scene and spends the entire time in prison camp. This is Isurason's third wife by his grave in Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow. That's the plaque behind which lie his ashes. Novodevichy is a very prestigious place to be buried, sort of an elite cemetery. Now, having got his biography out of the way, I would like to go into some more detail about the deep operation. Now, in the 1930s, the Soviet Union was changing from its backwards agricultural past. It was being transformed as a result of Stalin's forced industrialization policies. These had an enormous effect on the Red Army, and in a few short years, the Red Army was completely transformed and had become a modern mechanized force, at least numerically, on a par with any other country. Soviet theorists, at the same time, just like their counterparts in the West, were intensely concerned about how to avoid a repetition of the 1914-1918 trench deadlock. We see the same sorts of writings and researches going on in France with de Gaulle, in Germany with Guderian, Fuller and Littlehart in Britain. These are people who were rightly so aghast at the slaughter of the Western and Eastern fronts and were looking for any way to avoid having that happen again. In the Red Army, these searches became distilled in what they called the Глубокая операция, or the deep operation, of which Isurson is the leading exponent. Now, key to the deep operation is what Isurson called the new forms of combat. These are tanks, aircraft, and long-range artillery. These, of course, had all been present during World War I, but they were either too few or too technically not up to par, so that they could not realize their full potential during that conflict. The new forms of combat, according to the Isurson, now allow modern armies to avoid the kind of lumbering, lurching, grinding offensives so characteristic of the major operations of the Great War. These operations are distinguished by one thing, their inability to engage the entire enemy position. Because of their limited range, artillery, aircraft, and even the tanks there can only engage a little bit of the enemy front line at a time without affecting his rear. These new longer range weapons, the new means of combat, now allow the attacker to inflict damage throughout the entire depth of the enemy's position, allowing the attacker to suppress his defense throughout. In fact, Isurson is totally obsessed with the idea of depth. I wish I had $1 for every time I came across the word deep or depth in his writings. He saw this concern over depth as a natural development in the art of war. You must remember, Isurson is an Orthodox communist. He's a member of the Communist Party, and he tries to fit the reigning ideology into his military theory. So his writings are suffused with Marxist theory, and he tries to basically fit this into the Marxist mold. So he sees the military developments in the first third of the 20th century as a logical continuation of what has been going on ever since the 18th century in Europe. For example, in his 1932 work, The Evolution of Operation Ark, Iserson called the the Napoleonic era art of war the strategy of the single point, in which both sides will maneuver in order to bring their entire armed force to bear at one single point, such as at Ulm, Jena, Austerlitz, Waterloo. No extended flanks or anything. Everything is concentrated on a very small battlefield. Now, as you're aware, improvements in weapons in the 19th century start having an effect and start tearing the Napoleonic art of war apart. Now, because of the rapid rate of fire and increased accuracy, the focus of the battle starts to shift to the flanks, because attacking an opponent head-on, as it might have done in 1815, is now suicidal, as we learned at Cold Harbor in this country. This becomes very obvious in the Franco-Prussian War and the Russo-Japanese War. Iserson calls this the era of the linear strategy, when armies tended to spread out in linear fashion. However, just as in Marxist theory, when you have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. In the 20th century, the time of the linear strategy, comes to an end with World War I. Why? Because of the disappearance of flanks. It's now impossible, say in the Western Front, when you're bounded on one side by the North Sea or the South by Switzerland, it's impossible to go around the enemy and turn his flank. What does that leave you with? It leaves you with the breakthrough. That's the only option you have now. However, as you're well aware, there were many and all of them unsuccessful offenses during World War II. All of them failed to achieve an operational level breakthrough. Tactical breakthroughs, of course, all very small, all very localized, and having no long-lasting operational results. On this basis, based on the study of military history since the 18th century, and particularly on the study of World War I, Iserson concluded that we are now at the dawn of a new age in military art and must move from a linear strategy to a deep strategy. Now he's talking about strategy, the highest form of military art at this stage. This strategy being calling the shots, so to speak, this naturally has a trickle-down effect on the subordinate discipline of operational art. And it serves as the theoretical basis for his later elaboration of the theory of the deep operation. Iserson's chosen instrument for realizing the deep operation is the shock army, the Udarная Armia. He laid out this organization in a 1933 book, which is still top secret to this day, entitled Fundamentals of the Deep Operation. The shock army is a combined arms force that would be capable of independently breaking through the enemy's tactical and operational defense and exploiting this success in his operational depth. Iserson's ideal shock army consisted of several reinforced regular and regular rifle corps, a cavalry corps, a mechanized corps, a motorized division, airborne troops, and an air component. This would yield a strength of some 350,000 men, 1,500 artillery pieces, 1,500 tanks, plus a little over 1,000 aircraft, as well as various attachments from the High Command Reserve. Iserson divides his deep operation into three types. There's the meeting operation, the breakthrough operation, and the defensive operation. Of course, they are different in their objectives and their methods of conduct, but they all share a single trait: the deep echelonment of forces in order to achieve this objective. Now, the meeting operation is most likely to occur at the beginning of a war, when hostilities have just broken out and there is no front line to speak of. Both sides will mobilize their armies at some distance from the border, at some remove from each other, and particularly if both sides are pursuing an offensive strategy, they will move forward toward each other and somewhere collide. Particularly, again, if both sides are pursuing an offensive strategy, much as what happened in the West in August 1914. Now, the shock army and its neighbors comprise the country's first strategic echelon. This is the body of troops that launches the first operation, while the rest of the country's resources are being mobilized in the rear. The shock army in the meeting operation moves forward towards this clash with the opponent's in the meeting operation with the opponent in several clearly defined echelons. The first of these is long-range aviation, which will go over the shock army and begin to pound the enemy's arriving troops and his reserves even before the two sides catch sight of each other. The second echelon is the shock army's mechanized and motorized units, which he will use to maneuver and try to get around the enemy's flanks. Remember, even though this is the age of the deep strategy, at this point in time, at the beginning of the war, you still have open flanks, so there's still certain room for maneuver. The main body, which is primarily made of infantry corps, followed by a reserve. Behind this lies the country's second strategic echelon, which is only beginning the process of mobilization deep in the rear. Now, upon encountering the enemy, the mechanized or the vanguard echelon attacks along the main axis and seeks to turn the enemy's flanks and surround and destroy a part of his force. This has to be done quickly, though, because you're leading with your mechanized forces, and they have a very limited lifespan. Iserson calculated that these could only operate independently of the main body for about 3 days, after which they would have to be returned to the main body, and the infantry will come up to take up the slack, so to speak. However, Iserson believed that even if the shock army were successful in the initial meeting operation, it is the prejudice of the age, so to speak, that is the tendency towards positional warfare, which is conditioned, of course, by the nature of weapons available at the time. The tendency of the age is toward a war of position, much like as happened during World War I. So even if the shock army is able to defeat the enemy, 9 times out of 10, he will be able to withdraw faster than the enemy than the victor can pursue, and at some point in the rear, he will be able to establish a new positional front, which would necessitate the conduct of a breakthrough operation. This corresponds probably to September, October 1914, once the initial war of maneuver had come to an end and the positional front set in, at least in the West. Iserson calculated the enemy's defense will consist of an immediate tactical zone, right here, extending some 12 or 15 kilometers behind the front. Behind this is an operational zone, extending back some 50 to 60 kilometers. And behind this is a rear zone extending as far back as 100 to 125 kilometers, where the Army and strategic reserves will lie. So this is another good illustration of Iserson's fascination with depth. Modern defense is, by its very nature, deep. And the only way an attacker can overcome this kind of defense is to oppose it with his own depth, or at least something deeper. Now, to penetrate this deeply echelon defense, Iserson has divided his shock army into two parts. There's the attack echelon, which is made up of the aforementioned reinforced or regular rifle corps. They, supported by tanks, will attack and attempt to break through along a relatively narrow front, break through the enemy's tactical defense along this narrow front. At the same time, the Air Force will proceed to attack targets in the enemy rear and disrupt the arrival of the enemy's operational and strategic reserves to the front in order to isolate the area of the breakthrough. The shock army's breakthrough development echelon is consisting of a mechanized group, motorized group, and cavalry. Remember, this is still the Red Army of the 1930s, so cavalry still has an important role to play. This success development echelon will then be introduced and will erupt, either completing the breakthrough of the tactical zone or be introduced into a clean breakthrough in order to run riot in the enemy's rear, destroying his reserves and trying to prevent him from establishing a new defensive front. This is just another way of looking. This is a shock rifle corps, reinforced rifle corps, reinforced generally with infantry support tanks and artillery. This is another one. They blast through the hole, and the success development echelon here will then be introduced. This is another view of it. In this one, you see the infantry, the attack echelon has pushed back the wings of the enemy front, allowing this open breach to occur, and the mechanized corps is introduced here, and the cavalry corps here along the flanks. And they advance to approximately 50, 60 kilometers depth and are already here engaging the defenders' main reserves. Now finally, given the highly offensive nature of Soviet strategy, it's hardly surprising that the defensive operation received such short shrift in the Soviet era. Iserson well acknowledged this fact, and even at one point said that to even raise the question of conducting a defensive operation in the 1930s was, quote, considered somehow indecent, unquote, and might even expose the speaker to charges of political unreliability. It only stands to reason, if your propaganda machine has been maintaining all along that the Red Army is the most offensive, that is in the sense of attack, the most offensive force in the world, it would hardly behoove you to go on at length about conducting defense. It sounds defeatist, and many people were denounced and accused of defeatism. Iserson's version of the defensive operation is sort of the reverse of his breakthrough operation. Again, if you're going to stop a modern attack, a modern heavily echeloned attack, your defense must be echeloned in depth as well in order to absorb the blow and repel it and then launch a counterattack. This involves, if the attack is strong enough, luring the enemy tanks, because modern defense is above all anti-tank defense. You lure the enemy tanks into killing zones before launching a counterattack of your own. This was contained in his book, The Fundamentals of the Defensive Operation, which came out in 1938. It doesn't seem to have done the Army much good at the time and was pretty much ignored. It was sort of a half measure because, as events would prove, what the Red Army needed at the time was not so much a manual on conducting defensive operations, but conducting a strategic defense in light of what happened in 1941, which they were caught completely off guard. Now, The ultimate test of any theory, of course, is its practical application. And having reviewed any number of operations and compared them with Iserson's theories, I come to the conclusion that he certainly passes the test. And his theories were used widely during World War II. Granted, he was not given any kind of credit for them because he was, again, enjoying the fresh air of the far north at the time. Also, the war itself forced the Soviets to make a number of changes to Iserson's theories, although basically they remained intact. For example, the German invasion of 1941 came as such a surprise that the Red Army could not conduct its own strategic meeting operation. It was caught with its pants down, so to speak, and had no time to react. Therefore, the German attack rolled on without meeting a similar attack from the Soviet side. What attacks the Soviets did launch were pretty scattered and disorganized, never really arising above the operational level. However, when it became their turn in 1945 in Manchuria, when the Soviets launched their own surprise attack on the Japanese, this meeting operation, starting from immediately crossing the border, took the Japanese by surprise and was in many ways a masterpiece, rolled right over the Japanese, covering hundreds of kilometers in a very short time. Defensively, the story is much the same. In the autumn of 1941, the Soviets had constructed a defense of sorts to the west of Moscow. However, it was based on a very thin crust, had no depth or hardly any depth at all. As a result, when the Germans struck in October 1941, they sliced through it very quickly and surrounded hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. 2 years later at Kursk, in July of 1943, the Soviets have taken Iserson's lessons to heart. They have constructed the last word in a deeply echelon defense. Tactical defensive layers extending back, followed by operational defensive layers, followed by strategic defensive line. The Germans simply grind themselves out, chewing through one line after another. Granted, the Soviets did not heed Iserson's advice here. Instead of attacking the breakthrough salient along its flanks and cutting it off, the Soviets at Kursk frittered away their tank forces by attacking the entire rim of the bulge, which of course gave the Germans some scary moments, but it cost the Soviets hundreds of tanks. By late 1942, the Soviets have finally learned how to conduct the breakthrough operation against a solid enemy front. This is the case at Stalingrad when they launch attacks on either side of the city. This is the case in Belarusia when they launch 6 attacks on this huge bulge and cut the German army to pieces, and in January of 1945 in Poland when they shatter the German front with large tank army attacks along various sectors. Iserson's contribution toward the Soviet victory come out in other ways. While he was a professor at the General Staff Academy, a number of students studied under him who later went on to great careers during World War II. These were colonels at the time. Of course, the purges, which started next year, cut off an entire layer ahead of them, so they received rapid promotion afterwards. And these were the people who met the German invasion. These include three defense ministers, 4 chiefs of staff, several front and army commanders, and their chiefs of staff. So although Iserson was not fated to take part in the war, he nevertheless, I think, had a very decisive effect on its outcome. That's why I named my book The Architect of Soviet Victory in World War II. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, please raise your hand. And if you would please, as a courtesy to others, please limit yourself to one fairly easily askable question, and we'll get a microphone around to you. In the back first, and then you, sir.
Yeah, I'm not sure I need a microphone. Okay. Yeah, could you briefly speak to the collaboration or influence of other Soviet theorists which were more conventionally associated with deep theory? For example, Svechin. Did the boys get together and talk about it over vodka, or how did it, was it in the air? What's the impact of Svechin and some of the others?
Well, Svechin's impact or influence on the operational art was very limited. He, was that me?
Moving your head too much.
Oh, okay. He had some influence in devising what later became known as the theory of consecutive operations, which Iserson latched on to as well. This is when you make an operational lurch and carry the operation as far as you can go, and then have to halt in order to bring up supplies for the next leap forward. That's really one of the few areas, at least in the area of operational art, that Svechin was active in, although he coined the term operational art, so we give him credit for that. As regards his influence, what influence he might have had on Iserson, I doubt that very much. They taught at the same academies, but Iserson would have been the kind to denounce people like Svechin, whom he grouped with people like Shaposhnikov, these old military specialists, that is, Tsarist-era relics, who, for reasons of their own, for one reason or another, had attached themselves to the Red Army and were now making careers in that. He despised these people. Iserson tended to have a very black and white view of the world on any number of questions. And so he saw himself, of course, and any number of other younger officers who had come of age in the Red Army as sort of the forces of light, as opposed to these dark forces of reaction who were hopelessly mired in the experience of World War I, and probably because of their class roots, no doubt, could not bring themselves to make this mental breakthrough and grasp the implications of these new means of combat.
And sir, up front.
Could you comment on Iserson's, either his influence on the development of Soviet armor and mechanized forces, or conversely, any impressions he had on that development?
As far as I know, he had no real relationship to the technical side of things. He was purely a theorist and tried to make do with what he was given. He did have some post-war comments or post-Stalin comments on the development of the Soviet armored force. The most notorious, you may be thinking of this, is the decision in 1939 to disband the tank corps, as they were called. These were huge formations, numbering around 1,000 tanks. They only had 4 of them at the time, and granted they were clunky and difficult to manage, but they were there. And then in 1939, of all times, after having seen what the Germans could do with armor forces in Poland, the Soviets made the decision to break them up into brigades and, in some cases, divisions, basically negating 6 or 7 years of work. The following year, after France, the Soviets suddenly, it's funny. They've gutted their armor force and split it up all over, and then the Germans show in France again what can be done, and it's almost as you can hear in the Kremlin this kind of audible uh-oh, and then they have this mad scramble to reconstitute along German lines 2 tank divisions, a mechanized division, to create these, again, very large 1,000-tank armor corps, 29 of them in all. 29 corps, which translates, if you actually are able to flesh it out, translates to about 90 tank divisions, which would, of course, dwarfed anything. But they had this on paper, but they didn't have the tank strength. So he condemned that, and rightly so, condemned that 1939 move, again, as another typical example of, I don't know, Stalinist whims, or whoever dictated this. Just of how badly the Red Army intellectually had been degraded by the purges, that they could, in light of all the evidence to the contrary, could make such a decision. But as far as his being involved in the technical side, no.
Other questions? Questions? Have time for a couple more? Yes, sir, in the back, please.
During what years did you do your work, especially the research at the KGB archive? It's my understanding that there was a loosening of things during the Yeltsin era, but after Yeltsin was gone, that the KGB archive closed up again to non-Russian researchers.
Basically, that's true. It's unfortunately a number of bad old habits are reasserting themselves. I was there doing research for my dissertation in the 90s, which, as it transpires, was the golden age of working in the Russian archives, when a gift of the gab and a well-placed gift could get you all sorts of things that people could only have dreamed about before. When I used to go over there, since most of these archives, even the military ones, are run by women, I used to take over all sorts of cosmetics and other gifts before I would do my research, just to kind of sweeten everything, and so I could get what I wanted. That's the case, and since then, yes, there has been a tightening up. I worked in the KGB archives in 2004. I don't know what the situation there is now. I got in there, I had to go through a lot of hoops, but I don't think it was anything anybody else didn't have to go through. It was very odd. Since I wanted to see Isur-Son's arrest record, I had to, because you never know what people are going to say during their interrogation, to embarrass themselves or others, they always make access, if the individual is deceased, they always make access conditioned upon the permission of the nearest relative, which in this case was Isur-Son's daughter, who was at the time in her late 70s. And so I had to get permission from her. Problem is, when she got married, she changed her name. And she had no record of her marriage certificate. So I had to go to the place where she had originally been married, to the records office, stand in line, and get a copy of her marriage certificate. Then take it to her, have her go to a lawyer's office, get it notarized, and only then could I take it and get a written note from her saying, yes, I allow this man to read my father's file. And only then could I go to the KGB archives and they would allow me to do it. This took a couple of months. You can imagine the look on the people at people's face at the records office. They say, what do you need this information for the marriage thing? And I said, well, I'm going to work in the KGB archives. I really need this with my accent. And but they gave it to me. I'll give them credit. I never, and they were very nice to me. Always bought me parts of it were stapled together though, and I was always tempted to bring in my own staple and to pry it apart and then staple it back, but I didn't want to risk it. But very, very interesting. A person's arrest file is very interesting. All 150 pages of it. It's good though, because when they arrested you back then, and at the time, I had most, if not all, of Isur-Son's writings, his theoretical writings. But aside from a very general outline, I knew very little about his life or his service career. And the great thing about being arrested, at least for researchers, back in the 30s, was that they made you tell everything trace your activities all the way back to Adam. And so it was his complete military biography all laid out in front of me. And the scribe or whatever who was sitting there in interrogations, he had very nice handwriting, never had any problem. So that worked out very well. I suppose I've heard though that a lot of the archives they've merged like the security archives with the regular archives, and so as not to double staff them, they got rid of the regular people and kept the security people in there. And I guess anywhere with archivists, there's two schools of thought. Archives are there to be kept, or archives are there for it to be used by researchers. I think, unfortunately, the former has gotten the upper hand. Yes?
She's coming right behind you, Don.
Richard, one of the problems with intellectual history is always trying to pin down the actual linkages to prove the influence of something. And in this case, you've made a pretty good argument that from the way the Red Army conducted operations, they were reflecting Eason-Sohn's thoughts. But you mentioned also that Stalin did, or at least was alleged to have said, hold off on arresting him until he finishes the book. This would sort of imply that there was an interest, that there was some value seen in his theory. And can you make that link to show that the book was specifically read, used, and that it had that kind of a direct influence?
I don't know, because as much as it irritates me to admit this, I've never seen the book. The thing is, like I said, he wrote the book, delivered it to the military publishing house, and was arrested on the way home. But he did have a copy. He had a copy at home, and then the war broke out. And his wife and daughter at the time said, well, you never know. Let's write a letter to Stalin saying we've got this great book here, and it might help out our boys at the front. So they wrote a letter. She said she even took it and put it in the mailbox. And didn't work out quite the way they wanted to. A second team of investigators came and ransacked the apartment again, confiscated that manuscript. The daughter said that someone told her later that the manuscript had been published as an internal document under someone else's name. And I tried all sorts of by hook and crook methods to find out if this were true, and if so, whose name it had appeared under. This was the follow-on piece. He had written a piece that came out in 1940 called "The New Forms of Combat," analyzing and condemning the war, the way the Spanish Civil War was fought, the permanence of position in that war, as opposed to the way the Germans had conducted the Polish War of 1939. His follow-on book was going to analyze the war in the West in 1940 and the war in the Balkans, basically as a confirmation of the Germans taking his ideas and putting them into practice. That's one of the great regrets of this project, that I got my hands on some really esoteric stuff that I shouldn't have had, but this is the one thing I couldn't get a hold of, and I was never able to track that document down. Eason was certainly well respected. There's a family story, and I was never able to confirm this, that his daughter told me. And she, her dad was sort of yanked out of her life when she was a young teenager, and only reappeared when she was in her late 20s. And she would get a lot of this stuff, and you never know how real it was, how true it was. According to her, during the Finnish War, Stalin summoned Eason to the Kremlin for a conference and laid out a map for him, says, I want you to look at this plan and give me your thoughts on it. This is a special plan. Eason, according to this version, looked at it, denounced it as a paste-up job, basically, at which Stalin pitched a fit and told him to get out. So, which, if it's true, it says a lot that Stalin had some respect for him. When he got home, Eason told his wife what had happened, and she said, well, you just better pack your bags. A lot of people at the time, when the purges were at their height, simply went to bed at night with a suitcase full of clothes ready by their side in case they had to leave suddenly. a number of people in the post-war era did, a number of his former students did write him. For example, Marshal Vasilevsky, who was chief of staff for most of the war, says, basically, I got a lot out of your lectures. You made a tremendous, you had a tremendous influence in the Army. We felt every day your influence and your contribution to the war, to the victory over Germany. Unfortunately, again, Iserson, last 20 years or last 30 years of life, he's grinding his teeth because he was close but never closer, and he couldn't see his own theories realized.
And over here, sir.
I have one question. When you were doing your research, did the people you were talking to while you were doing the research, did they know who this guy was, or it was just,
Yes.
Oh, you did. Okay.
In a small circle of aficionados, he was well known. Obviously, his daughter, from whom I got a lot of day-to-day stuff, his personality, his quirks, his foibles. I talked to another, a General Kirschen, who used to work at the Military History Institute in Moscow, who had befriended Iserson when the latter was an old man, and they had a lot of discussions. Another fellow was Colonel Sverdlov, who's now deceased, but he had known Iserson as well, and they had heard of him. I mean, despite this sort of semi-official taboo on him, because even after he's rehabilitated in '55, his name pops up just a handful of times. All the glory goes elsewhere. Despite this semi-official taboo, his name was still very well known, and he was highly thought of amongst a very small circle. But these people, they couldn't do anything about it. So and even today, he's still sort of semi-unknown, even though he's finally got a mention in the Russian military encyclopedia.
Other questions? Dr. Harrison, if I could ask one question which follows on to the gentleman's question in reference to archives. All of us have done research at different times, and all of us have no doubt experienced difficulties doing research. Your particular area is fascinating for the amount of difficulty that you've had to go through. And earlier you related a story about one of your difficult periods of doing research. Could you tell that one again?
Oh, okay. Yeah, this was happened in the early 90s, again, the golden era of military research. I was working in the Military History Institute in Moscow. It was like by special dispensation of the king or something, because as opposed to just walking in here, for example, to do research, they told me later that they had been a couple of rules just to get me in there. They had an officer every morning. They would draw up a a request that I be admitted that day. And every morning this officer would take that request, run it over to the Ministry of Defense, and get someone to stamp it and bring it back to make it legal. And every day that I did this had to be done in the morning, just so I could work there. The reason I was there, and they assigned me to my great good fortune, they assigned me to a colonel who, I guess we would say, very progressive in his views, and didn't care for a lot of the old censorship that had been the case in the Soviet era. So I said, well, I'm writing, this was when I was writing my dissertation, and I said, I'm writing this dissertation on the development of Soviet interwar operational art. And I was wondering if you would happen to have these, and these following documents. And one of them was this fantastic document. It's a how-to-do book for conducting the deep operation. And it's stamped top secret. And he says, here, I'll give this to you. Don't tell anyone, obviously. I said, no, of course not. He says, I'm going to give you this. Every morning, I'm going to take it out of the safe. I'm going to give it to you. End of the day, you take it back. You give it back to me, and I'll put it in the safe. I said, fine. This is 150 pages. I said, gee, that's a lot. Is there any photocopying this? No, this is old Battle Axe running the photocopy machine, and she's sure to raise a stink, so you'll have to figure out something else. So I ended up having to basically copy the entire book. It was that good. It's Easterstone's, basically, it's his classic work. And so I painstakingly, over the course of about 2 or 3 weeks, copied out every bit of that book. Later, they got a new lady at the photocopying machine, and I was able to get the thing done for $11. But I remember they said, well, we got a young worker there now. She's willing to do this, and I said, well, how much it costs? And they named some fantastic figure in thousands and thousands of rubles. Of course, this is a time of skyrocketing inflation in Russia. I'm doing the math in my head, and yeah, it comes out to $11. So okay, I can live with that, and it worked out very well. I don't know. It's a funny, it's a gray area. You know, the documents should be out there, and so you want to give them a little push by doing what you can to liberate them.
Any other questions? Dr. Harrison, thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Harrison, you've done a couple things for us tonight. First of all, for those several of us in the audience who have studied operational art from an American perspective, you've certainly given us the other side and where all of that comes from. And from the other small majority of us, myself included, who always thought the Eastern Theater was Virginia, we've learned a whole lot more about how the Soviets operated. Generally, usually, our discussions and what we do here at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center is to tell the Army story one soldier at a time. We generally imagine that is our Army. But what you've given us is a reflection of a soldier in an Army who has had a great effect on that Army. And that, in the end, is what we're doing here from the U.S. side. And we really appreciate the opportunity to see that from the Soviet perspective. We applaud you for all of your hard work here, and we thank you for all of the amount of time that you've spent here in the Army Heritage and Education Center. And sir, on behalf of Colonel Mark Viney, our director, and all of our staff who work with you every day, we'd like to present a small memento of your talk and appreciation for your visit.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't want you to go away empty-handed. So, in recognition of, or express my thanks for allowing me to work here, I'd like to give the Institute a copy of the book. At $50 a pop, it's the least I could do.